Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christy.
And I'm Melissa. And this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
dirtbag murderers.
Hey listeners.
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
We are happy that you're here.
We are.
Just like always.
It's true. We love you guys, and we love being able to bring you different cases each week.
And Christy's got a Canadian one for us.
I do. If you are listening from Canada, you already know that Canada Day is fast approaching. July 1st is a day that we celebrate the formation of our country. Canadians love to celebrate this day with parades, fireworks, barbecues, and red and white decorations. It is a time to bring our country and loved ones together. Regardless of where you live, I am sure you feel the same way when you celebrate your home country. Staying true to how we do it on Buried Motives, I am bringing you a Canadian case. We're going to Winnipeg.
Who goes to Winnipeg?
Don't you remember that commercial?
No.
There was some kind of commercial where a guy had free flight miles and he gets on this plane and he's on the wrong plane and he's like, well, I guess we're going to Winnipeg when he realizes. If I remember correctly, he was all dressed up in like Bermuda shorts and he was ready for a holiday and no, we're going to Winnipeg.
I have been to Winnipeg several times.
I have not.
It's a cool place to visit.
Well, I have not been there, but possibly one day.
We've driven through there lots of times and stayed overnight.
On your way through.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true for a lot of Canadians. I have a feeling that this case is going to stir very differing opinions from our listeners. You might hate today's dirtbag, but you might also feel sorry for her. She was disadvantaged, lived the life she was taught, and unfortunately ended up committing a mass murder because of it.
A mass murder?
Mass murder. This woman has to forever live with the consequences of her actions, but so do the people who loved the victims who sadly lost their lives because of her. Kind of a sad case.
There's just so many victims with a mass murder.
Exactly. So we're just going to get right into it. Lulonda Lynn Harper, who would later go by the last name Flett, was born in 1971 in a hospital in Norway House. Lulonda's mother was told by her doctor to go to Norway House to give birth because the community where she lived, in St. Teresa Point, was too risky. There wasn't a proper medical facility there, and a doctor only visited once each month. Let me explain a bit about this area before we carry on, because it does explain partly the start that Lulonda got in life. I will note that I have not been to these places, but I'm sharing what I found while researching, so hopefully I will explain it well. Norway House is a population center 30 kilometers, or 18.5 miles north of Lake Winnipeg, on the bank of the eastern channel of Nelson River in the province of Manitoba. Two communities kind of share the name Norway House. It comprises a First Nation reserve and an adjacent non-reserve community. The Norway House Cree Nation is now one of the largest Indigenous communities in Manitoba. It is actually one of the very first Hudson Bay trading posts from the fur trading days. Because Norway House is where two communities meet, it has both a chief and a mayor, which I found interesting. St. Teresa Point is a reserve that is part of 3 to make up St. Teresa Point First Nation, and one of 4 to make up the overall community of Island Lake. The distance between St. Teresa Point and Norway House is 196 kilometers or 121 miles. This means that Lulonda's mother had to travel a couple of hours to give birth. But by the time Lulonda was born, she was familiar with the dealings of having a baby. Lulonda was baby number 6 out of 7 children that her mother gave birth to. Sadly, Lulonda only grew up with 5 siblings instead of 6, as one child died in infancy. Around the time that the murders took place, 463 homes out of 521 did not have water service. If I mathed correctly, that is a staggering 89% of homes without clean running water. This may shock some of you, but many reserves in Canada still do not have clean, drinkable water today, which always blows my mind.
It is so sad.
It is. To add to the water crisis, around this time there was an 83% food insecurity rate, and groceries cost around 50% higher than the average retail price. I do want to note that these stats were from 2013 and the murders took place in 2011. So I would guess that it would have been similar living conditions at the time. And who knows how bad they would have been in 1971 when Lulonda was born. Needless to say, this was not an easy life for people living in the area. Growing up, Lulonda's mother worked as a community health worker, and her father worked odd jobs to try and support their large family. To me, odd jobs might imply that he didn't always have steady work. Unfortunately, both of Lulonda's parents struggled with alcohol addiction. They drank so much that it was considered just the norm for the children. They grew up thinking that putting the bottle before all else was just what parents and people did. When Lulonda's parents drank, that seemed to be all that mattered. Lulonda's father would go on drinking binges to Winnipeg, and often her mother would join him, sometimes for weeks or even months. The children would stay with an auntie, and sometimes they were left in the care of their older sister, Malene. It sounded like at times the parents would go out to a party and then just not return home for days or weeks at a time, leaving their house full of children to fend for themselves. When the parents were partying at their home with other adults, the older sister Malene would gather all of the children and stay in a bedroom with them. She knew that drinking would often lead to violence, and so she tried her best to shield her younger siblings from it.
She sounds like a sweet sister.
She was very protective of her siblings. She knew that this was not okay. Inside the room, she would play with them and turn on music or the TV. When it got late, she would sleep in front of the door to protect them. If she laid in front of the bedroom door, no one could enter without her knowing. So it is safe to say that this oldest sister very much took on a parental and protective role in the home.
She sounds incredible.
Right? How sad that she felt that she had to sleep in front of the door to protect them, because she didn't want anyone creeping in there without her knowing. During the times that Lulonda stayed at her auntie's home, while her parents partied in Winnipeg, she eventually began to be abused by a male relative. She was less than 10 years old while this was happening.
That's so disgusting.
So sad.
Especially when it's a relative.
Yes, because there's that level of trust. And sadly, it usually is a relative or someone that you know.
Mm-hmm.
Lulonda told her mother what was happening to her, and her mother didn't believe her. Instead, she accused Lulonda of lying so that she wouldn't have to sleep over at her auntie's house. It was like, you're just making that up so you don't have to sleep over. You just want to ruin my partying. What would that do to your psyche as a little girl? Lulonda told her auntie as well, but she dismissed the young girl's claims also. Lulonda later said about this, quote, "Nobody believed me, so I just stopped trying to tell them." These adult women in Lulonda's life let her down. First of all, she was being abused by a male relative while her parents were off drinking on binges. Then the two women who had Lulonda in their care called her a liar once she gathered the courage to tell them what was happening. This had to have had such a devastating impact on Lulonda's self-worth. She was not protected, and I assume the abuse continued. This would also lay the foundation for Lulonda believing that she was there to be abused.
It's just so sad. And it never gave any indication why her aunt or her mother didn't believe her?
No. They're like, quit making trouble, don't lie.
They just didn't want to have to deal with it?
I think so.
Or they couldn't believe that of their relative?
Well, I think honestly her mother was intoxicated most of the time and didn't see any of the signs that other moms maybe would be looking for.
Or it makes me wonder if both of them were abused too, and it was just an accepted way of life for them. Oh, this happened to me, and so you should just shut up about it. It just happens.
That's a good point. But they called her a liar.
Oh.
But your assumption could be right. They could have gone through the same thing and just buried it down.
Sad either way.
It is. Because especially her mother is the one who should be there to help her.
Mm-hmm.
Lulonda, as an adult, expressed still being worried about her mother's relationship with her abuser. She didn't want to get in between them. This male relative later tried to apologize to Lulonda, I assume when all of this news came out. But Lulonda said she rebuked him and told him not to talk to her. He has never been charged. I didn't read any reports to support this, but I'm questioning if he was abusing Lulonda, what was stopping him from doing the same thing to some of her siblings. It had to have been a sad situation for all the children in the family. I just wouldn't put it past him. And it would be hard as a little girl to see your mom still having a relationship with this man that you've told her is sexually abusing you.
Mm-hmm. It would really confuse who you could trust.
Right. And like I said, what are you here for? You're here to be abused. When Lulonda was a teenager, around 14 or 15, she was sent to live in a residential school. She had to leave St. Teresa Point and resided at a school in Toulon that was run by nuns. Lulonda's older sister, who watched out for the sibling group, was sent there as well. Despite the devastating consequences that come along with being in a residential school, Lulonda did well academically. With perfect attendance, she was said to enjoy the classes and did get good grades. She also liked to play different sports.
It makes me wonder, is that because her environment at home was actually worse than the residential schools?
It's 100% that reason. Dr. Kent Summers, who later examined Lulonda during her court proceedings, stated about this time for Lulonda that, quote, school represented a refuge from the relative chaos at home. So you're totally right. As terrible as it was, I guess she felt safer than she did at home or at her aunt's house, and I'm guessing that it was the first time she had order or real stability in her life.
That is sad, because we know how awful residential schools were for most.
They were horrific, so that is saying a lot to what her family life was like. On the other hand, Lulonda's older sister Malene hated the residential school and left, but was quote-unquote convinced to return. So I'm taking that as forced.
Yeah.
Lulonda and her siblings had been raised in an Ojibwe-speaking home. At the school, they were only allowed to speak English 100% of the time. When Lulonda was around the age of 15-16, in 1986 or 87, she took her first drink of alcohol. She also met a boy named Brian who caught her eye around this same time. One thing led to another, and soon Lulonda was pregnant with her first child. She left school and had her baby at Villa Rosa in Winnipeg. Villa Rosa is a place for mothers to go to for pre- and postnatal care. I believe it is a residence to help mothers in need. After having the baby, Lulonda was determined to finish high school, so she moved in with a family member in Brandon. This relative had a drinking problem, so eventually Lulonda left and returned back to St. Teresa Point. Back at home, Lulonda got a job at the local nursing station and tried to attend school. However, this did not last long. Working, going to school, and being a new mom would be a giant hurdle for anyone. Lulonda admitted, quote, I had no time for myself. I always had a baby. And that she did. She would go on to have multiple children in a relatively short period of time.
Still with the same guy?
No. When she was 18, Lulonda met her future husband. I could not find his name. In one article, he was just referred to as B, the initial B. All the other articles just referred to him as her husband. This article was written by James Turner and was a good resource for Lulonda's life before the murders. B started out charming and treated Lulonda with kindness. Sadly, this would not last. He was a massive dirtbag, and because of that, we will be discussing some domestic violence. The couple married when Lulonda was 22 years old, and they had 5 children together, making her child count 6 in total. After getting married, the young family moved in with B's family near Garden Hill. Lulonda was described as a good mother, but unfortunately her life would take a path that would lead to much destruction and devastation. Lulonda would become addicted to alcohol and substances. Not only did she think it was just a normal thing that adults did, stemming from her parents' examples, but also her husband forced her to drink and do drugs with him. B would insist that Lulonda sit and drink with him. His violent tendencies didn't really give her a choice. So she was not a big drinker, but he insisted and literally forced her to do it. The couple would drink a concoction referred to by the locals in the islands as a plague. It was called super juice and was an extremely strong home brew or moonshine type of alcohol. To go along with the booze, B would make his wife smoke marijuana and eventually crack cocaine. This continued until it was pretty much a daily habit. The pair would even meet up on their lunch breaks to smoke together.
Where are all her kids during this?
They're all around. They're there.
So she's just creating an environment that her parents created.
Yep, following in their footsteps.
Okay.
As the substance abuse grew in their home, so did B's violence against Lulonda. He would abuse her physically, emotionally, and sexually. B kept Lulonda isolated from others. If he had to go out, he would lock her in the house and take her shoes with him so she wouldn't go anywhere. He would also remove the phone from the house and take that with him so she couldn't call for help or tell anyone what was going on. We had total control over her. When B would get violent, he would hit his wife with objects around the house and would even burn her with cigarettes. One particular time, after assaulting Lulonda, B dragged her across the rough ground, scraping her exposed skin. Lulonda managed to call the police, and B was charged and given a 6-month sentence in jail for domestic violence.
6 months.
Yeah, 6 months. When he got out, Lulonda took him back, and the violence resumed. He was a low-life bum who couldn't keep a job and was also sleeping around on Lulonda. The abuse got so bad that some community members started calling Lulonda Raccoon Eyes because her eyes were commonly blackened by B.
That's awful.
He is such a massive dirtbag. Lulonda and B got stuck in this cycle of brutal abuse. She would leave him, he would come crawling back to her and promise to never do it again, so she would take him back, and the abuse would start all over again. Only each time it seemed like it got worse than the time before.
It's almost like he was emboldened each time, because each time she took him back, he was like, oh, that's all that happened, and she took me back, so I can do more.
Right, I can push the envelope that much further.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like a reinforcement tactic.
Right. And feeling that she's never going to leave. If I can do all this to her, where people are literally calling her Raccoon Eyes and she's going to take me back, then I have free reign. Which just speaks to what a disgusting man he really is.
Right. And her confidence and her self-esteem is just plummeting during this time. And she's thinking, it's just reinforcing to her that she'll never get out from underneath of him.
Right. But she was taught at 10 years old that men can abuse you.
So sad.
It really is. People around the couple were obviously aware of the abuse. Lulonda's own children begged her to leave him for good. They feared that their father was going to kill her. On the flip side, B's parents and family told her that the violence was always her fault, basically saying he wouldn't have to be violent if you didn't do things to provoke him, type of thing.
Which again leads me to believe that they had all suffered from abuse too. This was just a normal thing.
Yep.
They were able to justify it so easily because it's probably something that they had already justified to themselves.
Right. If someone's going to hit you, you had it coming.
Mm-hmm.
So smarten up and he won't have to hit you.
Right.
Which is such a devastating thought that some people are living a life like that.
But it's how the cycle of abuse can continue.
Which is heartbreaking. Finally, the pair did split up for good, and B moved to Thompson while Lulonda stayed in St. Teresa Point. During the abuse, Lulonda had now been working at the community northern store and earned certificates for home care support work and first aid. I feel like deep down, Lulonda wanted a better life. She did try to better her situation, but it seemed like an uphill climb for her. Despite her achievements, Lulonda was now faced with the demon of addiction. She was drinking regularly. It was no longer being forced upon her by somebody else. In 2009, when Lulonda was around 38 years old, she discovered that she could have been collecting federal benefits for her children. This is the money that the Canadian government gives to parents to help with the cost of raising a family. It isn't a ton of money, but it does add up. Over the years of missed payments for all of her children, Lulonda was entitled to collect $14,000. Lulonda received this check, and with it, she and her kids moved to Winnipeg. Also in 2009, Lulonda met a man who was only referred to as C.
So you could only find C for his name too?
Right. There was no full name, just C in quotation marks.
That is interesting. It almost sounds like those names have been protected.
It was really challenging to figure out the names in this case. So definitely could have.
Do you know if there was a publication ban?
That I'm not sure of. But there was definitely something at play here that I couldn't access a lot of these names. So we're going to call him C.
Okay.
B and C.
And is there a D afterwards?
No.
Okay.
C was 36 at the time and from the same area that Lulonda grew up. Lulonda and C met when he was on a trip into Winnipeg to binge drink, just like her parents had done while growing up. So this seemed perfectly normal to her. The two began dating, and Lulonda would later say that this was the best relationship she ever had. The two were said to be always together. Lulonda said about her newfound love, quote, "He never hit me, he never abused me, and he was always there for me."
Seems like a really low bar.
Yeah, but sadly, that's what it was. He was the best guy because he never hit her. Sadly, this fairy tale love would not end well. In order to support his drinking habits as an alcoholic himself, C would often beg for money on the streets and borrow money from friends and family. When that source of income was dry, he slowly started to use Lulonda and her $14,000 as his personal ATM.
Is that what attracted him to her?
That I'm not sure. Could have been.
That seems very suspicious.
Before all of the money would get blown through, Lulonda did give some to her mother, who helped to raise her children at times. So when you're asking about the kids, sometimes her mom did help out. Lulonda started to pay for pretty much everything for her boyfriend, C. They didn't really have a stable home to live in. They would stay at friends' and families' homes, but would manage to purchase alcohol. As the thousands began dwindling, C began to control Lulonda's money. Soon the couple were on welfare and spent all of the money they did have on booze. Being drunk was the main goal of every single day. Lulonda would later reflect on this time in her life by saying, quote, "It was all about the drinking. That's how I ended up here," meaning in jail for her later crime.
Just sad lifestyle.
Such a vicious circle, too. As things worsened, Lulonda's own children began urging her to quit. Lulonda did attempt a few times to sober up, but when she tried, the alcohol withdrawal would land her in the hospital, and she would almost automatically resume drinking upon her release. She expressed that it was hard to go back into an environment of drinking and not also drink. Plus, to her, ending up in the hospital over drinking was just a normal occurrence for adults. It's what she saw growing up. Lulonda had grown up with parents who behaved the same way she now was. But not everyone felt like it was a good scenario to raise children in, and so in 2010, during a heavy binge, someone called Child and Family Services on her.
I'm actually surprised it took that long.
Me too. As a result, all of Lulonda's children were taken away. One was sent to live with an aunt, her mother took 2 more, and the remaining children went and lived with their father.
They went to go live with the abusive father?
Yeah, with B.
That's a head shaker.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly how that happened, and I don't know by this time what his living situation was.
Or if he had stopped abusing, maybe?
If he had stopped drinking, I don't know. Hopefully.
Okay.
I didn't read any reports of bad things happening once they were sent there, but I didn't read reports of anything happening after, so who knows?
Okay.
But the courts felt that he was a better option than being with Lulonda at the time.
Which speaks volumes about the situation that she was creating for them.
Exactly. I will note that by this time, Lulonda's mother had sobered up. Lulonda's father developed stomach ulcers and kidney failure. Her mother, I believe, stopped drinking after his death. She was now 75 years old and raising 2 of Lulonda's kids. But again, I don't believe this was the first time she had some of them in her care. Lulonda spiraled even further downwards after this. She believed that her ex-husband B had called Child and Family Services on her. At this point, Lulonda said, quote, "I was lonely and depressed. I was angry at myself. I didn't care about myself." And it's hard for us to feel sorry for parents when this happens, but as a mother, regardless of her actions at the time, I feel like having your children removed from you would be quite devastating.
What would be?
She still loved her children. Unsurprisingly, though, with her children now gone from her care, Lulonda's drinking just increased. Instead of using the removal of her kids to motivate herself to get the help she needed, she wallowed in it, and her situation only got worse. Lulonda was now drinking up to a 26-ounce bottle of liquor every day.
Whoa, that's a lot.
That is a lot.
Somebody who drinks moonshine has to tell us if 26 ounces is a lot to drink in a day.
Right, because it sounds like a lot to us for liquor, but for water, it's nothing.
Yeah, maybe it's nothing.
We don't know. But
it was enough to build up an addiction for her.
It definitely was. And I'm assuming that it was a lot because at her own admission, her days consisted of getting as drunk as possible, blacking out from her alcohol consumption, waking up, and then starting the cycle all over again. And she did this day after day after day.
Okay, it has to be a lot then. It's consuming her whole life.
Right. And she's blacking out almost every single day.
That can't be good for your brain cells.
No, not at all. And so possibly this 26 ounces of liquor that they're talking about, that could be that home brew that was super potent. We're the wrong ladies to ask about liquor consumption. If she ended up in the hospital, she would get a prescription for Valium and then go right back to drinking, but now with pills as well. As it did during her childhood, drinking often led to violence, and in 2009 for Lulonda, she would get her first assault charge. This assault took place in a parking lot near Ellis Avenue and Maryland Street. I looked up the street view of this intersection. There are a few shops and a church nearby. The place looks like an older area of the city, and the only parking lot I saw close to there was the church parking lot. But I'm not certain that this is where the assault took place, plus it could have been different in 2009. The fight involved 3 women: Lulonda, her boyfriend's sister, Lynette Harper, and likely one of Lulonda's friends. It is reported that Lynette might have thrown the first punch at Lulonda, but then Lulonda and her friend let her have it. They were both seen relentlessly kicking and punching her. After hearing the case and seeing that she had no prior convictions, and taking into consideration that Lulonda pleaded guilty to the charge, the judge felt that this offense did not warrant jail time. Judge Donald Slough said to Lulonda at the time, quote, "I don't think you should end up with a record, but I do think supervised probation is a good idea." Subsequently, he sentenced her to 12 months of supervised probation. In addition, she was ordered to stay away from the victim and complete counseling. I did not find any reports that she did either of these things.
It's too bad, because it sounds like she got a slap on the wrist and a second chance.
Right. And she's a grown adult by this time. This isn't something in her teens. It's her first offense. She's pushing 40. He's trying to give her a chance here.
But she's also a grown adult that should know better.
Yes.
That's 20 years of adulthood that you can learn better habits.
Yes, she definitely should have. The judge at the time had no way of knowing, but perhaps jail time might have been in order, because less than 2 years later, she would commit a horrific mass murder. I was able to access a few court documents about this case, and did my best to piece together a little bit of the circumstances that led up to the murders. For whatever reason, Lulonda and her boyfriend C got into a nasty fight. The situation escalated to Lulonda becoming violent. Allegedly, C's mother, Marie Flett, called the police and Lulonda was arrested. Before I go on, I have to explain that I became so confused over the names in this case. Marie Flett was C's mother, not her ex-husband's mother, whom I'm assuming she got her last name Flett from. Marie and Lulonda have the same last name but are not related. It is coincidental. And to add to the confusion, Lulonda's maiden name was Harper, the same as Lynette, but again, no relation.
That's confusing.
I was extremely confused, but I figured it out. I persevered.
Good job, Christy. Good digging deep.
I tried. In regards to Marie, Lulonda at this point had now assaulted both her daughter, Lynette, and her son, C. As any mother would be, I bet I can safely assume that she was fed up with this woman's behavior and likely did call the police. Regardless, Lulonda was now slapped with an assault charge for the second time, and again ordered to stay away from Lynette. When Marie called the police, they quickly learned that Lulonda had an outstanding warrant out for her arrest over the parole of her assault charge in 2009 against Lynette, I assume for not complying to the terms of her parole. Lulonda was released from custody on July 13th, and sadly, 5 people would be dead because of her only 3 days later. This tells me that she learned absolutely nothing from getting arrested for a second time. This also meant that not only did she now have new charges against her for assaulting her boyfriend, but she also now had to face the violation of her prior charges. So she was in some hot water. On Saturday, July 16th, 2011, an extremely intoxicated Lulonda set out to get her revenge on Marie, C's mother, as well as on Lynette Harper, C's sister, whom Lulonda also blamed for her arrest. Instead of taking responsibility for her criminal actions, she was angry and blamed these 2 women for the trouble she was facing.
All because they called the cops.
Mm-hmm.
Because she was beating them.
Right. And her first charge, that was Lynette's fault.
Oh, okay.
So that was the mess that got her into the trouble in the first place. And now Marie was snitching on her. Not rational thinking, but this is how she was thinking. And she had been drinking for days up until this point, as soon as she basically got released.
Right. And previous to that, as a child, she had tried to report abuse and it hadn't been taken seriously. So I think she would almost develop an anger towards being reported herself for abuse or for violence.
That's a good point. Why did everyone else get away with it?
Yeah, I can see how that would be confusing to kind of process. I mean, she's an adult and she should be able to process that, but I wonder if that played into it.
That absolutely could have. In the wee hours of the morning, or middle of the night, depending on how you look at it, Lulonda told her boyfriend that she was going to burn down his mother's home. I assume he thought she was just ranting and raging and didn't take her seriously. Marie and Lynette were living in a green, 2.5-story rooming house located at 288 Austin Street North in Winnipeg, Manitoba. A rooming house is typically a home with multiple rooms designed to help out those who may be struggling with addictions. This particular rooming house had 13 bedrooms, as well as an area in the basement where people would sleep. Marie and Lynette were both currently living at this address, along with 5 other residents. Lulonda crept over to the house in the middle of the night, when she knew everyone would be sleeping. The front of the house had a set of stairs that went up the side of the front of the house, so you walked up to the stairs parallel to the house instead of face-on or perpendicular. The stairs led to a small covered porch where the door was. On the porch near the door was a couch. Lulonda made the drunken decision, even before arriving, to light this couch on fire. She knew that Lynette and Marie would be inside the house, but she was also aware that many other people were residing within the home as well. On this particular night, there were 8 people in total sleeping inside. In the court document, Lulonda was described as being, quote, grossly intoxicated when she started the fire. Regardless, her actions had grave consequences for the innocent people fast asleep that night in the safety and comfort of their own beds. It did not take long for neighbors and people driving past the home to see the fire and start calling the police. One woman named Nicole told CBC News the next day that she was driving past the house after it caught fire and quickly called 911. She said about the intensity of the blaze, quote, I felt the heat from the house. She explained that as the house burned, she saw people running around the front of the house and screaming. About this, she said, quote, It was really hard to watch. I'm just really sad that people were hurt last night, and that's it.
It would be horrific to watch.
Oh, it would. To hear people screaming and just that chaos. And the house went up pretty quickly. It was an older wooden house. First responders had their work cut out for them. The couch ablaze in front of the entrance made it difficult for them to enter and for the residents of the home to get out. Plus, it did not take long for the fire to spread. 6 of the 8 people inside the house that night were rushed to the hospital in critical condition. One man had to have CPR performed on him prior to transport. Soon, 5 of these 6 victims would succumb to their injuries and pass away.
So 2 got out.
2 got out. And the 6th person who went to the hospital sustained serious injuries but did live. Ironically, the only 2 people to escape the house without serious harm were Marie Flett and Lynette Harper, Lulonda's intended targets.
Oh, that is ironic. And how awful for those other people just to be caught in the crossfires.
Right. And it just made it so pointless.
People had died for no reason at all.
Yes. I'm grateful and glad that these 2 women survived. But what a tragedy that all these other had to die.
And how did they get out?
I will talk about it.
Okay.
Lynette does give an account of it. News of the fire quickly spread across the media. Friends and family of the rooming house residents were in a panic trying to find out if their loved one was okay. It was reported early on that 4 people had died and a 5th person was in hospital fighting for their life. A man named Todd Kalbach later spoke to the news and told them that when he heard about the fire, he drove straight to the house. His friend lived in one of the top bedrooms of the house with his cat. And I saw pictures of the burned home, and I cannot imagine pulling up to this house and seeing the devastation caused by the flames and knowing that a person you cared about was inside at the time of the fire, yet not knowing if your loved one was okay.
It would be surreal.
It would. Todd tried calling the hospital, but because he was not family, they would not give him any information. He learned later that day that his friend had died in the fire. Fire crew members reported that when they first got the call about 288 Austin Street North, around 2 o'clock in the morning, they were surprised. The fire department had recently been doing a lot of work making sure that rooming homes were more safe. Reed Douglas, Winnipeg's deputy fire chief, stated that this house had been under investigation for fire safety just a month prior to the blaze, and all fire hazard concerns had been rectified. It had just become more safe against the outbreak of a fire, and so they would have been familiar with the address as well as the layout of the home. However, the house was sadly already engulfed in flames when they arrived.
So just having their inspection done, they must have had multiple exits then that people could escape from. Why did all these people die?
Well, a lot of them were sleeping when it happened, and it burned so quickly that they didn't have the chance to get out. And I don't think it was as easy to get to the back exit. The front door was definitely the easier way, and that was totally engulfed in flames. The people to die in the fire that day were Norman Darius Anderson, age 22, Maureen Claire Harper, age 54, who was allegedly related to Lulonda, Kenneth Bradley Monkman, age 49, Dean James Stratton, age 44, and Robert Curtis Lafort, age 56. I believe Norman, Maureen, Kenneth, and Dean pretty much died in the fire. Robert tried to fight for his life, but had sustained brain damage from smoke inhalation. When doctors removed him from life support, he lived for hours before succumbing to his injuries. His sister Michelle was with him when he passed. She said, quote, "It was so incredibly torturous to hear someone you love struggling for every breath. I pleaded with God to have mercy and just take him."
And what's so sad is the halfway house. These were all people trying to turn their lives around.
Exactly. They were trying to make positive changes.
And you said one was her relative?
Yes.
Did she know her relative was in the house?
Mm-hmm. She knew she lived there. She knew everybody that lived there. First, authorities had to determine if this fire that took 5 lives was accidental or criminal. Once they knew it was criminal, they had to investigate all avenues. Was it a vengeful act against one of the residents? Or some even question if the fire was set as a result of a biker gang turf war that was happening at the same time in the area.
That would muddy the waters, trying to investigate that.
It really did at the beginning. Thankfully, it did not take police long to connect the dots and bring Lulonda in. She was arrested sitting in a bar.
Well, I wonder if it did take a little bit of time because the 2 that she was actually after were the 2 that lived.
Right.
So even if they were looking for motive of who killed the people that died, she wouldn't have been immediately connected to them.
Yes. But also, she had told her boyfriend, "I'm going to burn your mother's house down." I don't know for sure if he had said anything to police, but I would assume he probably spoke pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Even though his mother and sister survived. I'm not sure how long it took when questioned, but Lulonda did admit to her abhorrent actions. She pleaded guilty to 5 counts of manslaughter and 1 count of arson while reckless, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. Her official plea was made on October 12th, 2012.
I'm surprised she remembered if she was that drunk.
She doesn't remember a lot.
Okay, but she remembered enough snippets of it to know that she did it.
Yes, and was truthful about it. During the lead up to Lulonda's sentencing, many factors had to be taken into consideration. Firstly, she was examined by Dr. Kent Summers to determine if she was legally sane. In Dr. Summers' report dated April 26, 2013, he stated that after several interviews and psychological tests, that Lulonda did not present with any mental health issues that would grossly distort her reasoning or thought processes. So she was sane.
Yeah.
Dr. Summers did point out, however, that Lulonda's language skills were far below the normal range, and she was intellectually disordered. Lulonda's intellectual abilities landed in the borderline to low average range for her age. In regards to the case, this finding helped to explain how she could put so many people in danger. Lulonda was most likely to be directed by immediate considerations, mostly about herself, rather than an anticipation of long-term consequences. This means that her focus would typically be on her own needs and interests rather than the needs and interests of others. He did explain that this didn't mean she was self-centered, but that she had a, quote, limited capacity for anticipating others' needs or reactions while being, in comparison, acutely aware of her own hurt, fear, and perceived options.
So he's saying that she operates at a childish level.
Yes, intellectually, she's functioning a lot lower than the average person her age.
Yeah, but she's 40. So even a lot lower would still be an adult.
Yeah, he's saying she does not have the proper thought processes to fully think out her actions.
Okay.
It's immediate. I'm angry at these 2 women. I'm going to burn their house down.
So she's childishly impulsive.
Right.
Okay.
And if you add alcohol to her intellectual impairments, it was basically a recipe for disaster. Because of her limitations and intoxication, Lulonda later remembered very little of her crime. That being said, she was extremely remorseful. Lulonda stated, quote, "I never meant for this to happen. Every night I cry myself to sleep knowing I can't change what happened. I never thought alcohol could cause so much trouble. None of this would have happened if I didn't drink alcohol." She also said that she wished she had been the one to die that day.
I find that statement interesting because she had lived to see what alcohol could do to people and what poor decisions they would make while consuming alcohol. So I have a hard time believing that she didn't know that that was a consequence or a possible consequence.
Right. I think she meant I didn't know that I could kill 5 people when I didn't actually mean to kill 5 people.
Mm-hmm.
That it could lead to something this drastic. But I do get what you're saying. She still chose to drink alcohol knowing that it can limit your thought processes and
impair your judgment, do all of those things that can make you make these decisions.
Yes.
And unfortunately, when you consume alcohol, you don't get to choose which things it's going to impair and which decisions you're going to make then.
Yeah.
Like you're giving up that choice.
Exactly. It's not a defense.
No.
Nobody made you drink and nobody made you do these things.
Yeah.
Lulonda had only meant to scare the 2 women and said she did not intend to murder anyone that day. To counter this, Dr. Summers explained that although she didn't mean to kill anyone, she was capable of knowing that something horrible could happen as a result of setting the fire.
So she wasn't that intellectually disabled to not make that connection.
No, she absolutely knew that fire was dangerous and could hurt people. And it was pointed out that Lulonda was able to be successfully employed for years in order to support her children, and so she knew how to function in society. Her lack of a lengthy criminal record also supports this idea.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that she was in and out of the slammer all the time. The courts took into consideration in great detail Lulonda's background, her childhood growing up in St. Teresa Point, and the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse that she endured most of her life. In preparation for Lulonda's case, a Gladue report was created. A Gladue report is a type of pre-sentencing or bail hearing report that a Canadian court can request when considering sentencing an offender of Indigenous backgrounds under Section 718.2 of the Criminal Code. The purpose of the Gladue report is to bring forth information on the unique circumstances of Aboriginal people accused of an offense or Aboriginal offenders. These circumstances can include, but are not limited to, things like discrimination, physical abuse, separation from culture or family, or drug and alcohol abuse. A Gladue report was requested for Lulonda. Donna Bear Glover prepared this report. Her findings were similar to Dr. Summers. In this report, Donna Bear Glover outlined the history of colonization of Lulonda's community and provided statistics created because of difficulties of living in St. Teresa Point, basically supporting that there is a correlation between poverty and crime. These factors are all understandable, but the court also had to point out and consider the aggravating factors regarding Lulonda's actions. These factors included that she committed the offense just 3 days after being released on supervised probation. The crime was a serious one. She deliberately set the fire without regard to human life. She knew the house was occupied and knew the people who lived there. And she acted out of revenge for a perceived wrong against her.
Yeah, that seems like it should be number 1.
Yes. The mitigating factors were that she owned up to her actions by pleading guilty, she was genuinely remorseful, and she did not have a lengthy criminal past. Ultimately, though, what Lulonda did was reported in the documents as, quote, selfish, deliberate, and reckless. Also pointed out was the pain and suffering that she caused to so many people. 5 individuals had met an untimely death because of her, and they all had people who loved them, who were now greatly affected by her dirtbag actions. During the court proceedings, multiple victim impact statements were provided. Bradley Anderson was the 6th injured person who survived the inferno. He gave an account of his experience. He started out by thanking the fireman who saved his life. He explained that his friend, Robert Lafort, was staying overnight on the 3rd floor with him. His friend died and he survived.
Well, that would be a lot of survivor's guilt.
It would, because Robert wasn't even technically supposed to be there that night.
Yeah, it was his apartment.
Yes. He spoke about how he didn't just lose all of his belongings, but he lost his friends. He expressed that he experiences nightmares and can no longer feel safe in his home. Robert Lafort's mother and sister also gave gut-wrenching statements about losing their brother and son. It was said that all of the victim impact statements were emotional because everyone in the house that night knew Lulonda and were friends with her, and everyone staying in the house had been through challenges and were working towards making their lives better.
I remember when I did the case a couple weeks ago about the Silver Fox sisters, and reading those victim impact statements were very similar, that everybody knew everybody, they all came from similar backgrounds, and so it was so unfathomable about what they had done.
Yes, I did find that in this case as well. Remarkably, some of the victim impact statements were filled with love and compassion. Marie Anderson, the mother of Norman Anderson, stated that despite losing her son, she was not angry with Lulonda, but that she in fact loves her and hopes that things will go well for her. About this, the court document stated, quote, This expression of forgiveness and grace was shared by some of the other victims and serves as a reminder of the beauty and capacity of the human spirit. This is a beautiful thing, and I think this woman is a bigger person than a lot of us could be less than 2 years after losing a loved one at the hands of another.
Yeah, it is always so heartwarming when you see that forgiveness given.
And to actually express love for her.
Mm-hmm.
It also reminds me of just last week's case with Kent Whitaker and the forgiveness that he had to his son.
Yeah. It's just incredible, the capacity of the human heart when we allow it to be like that.
Yes. And hopefully that forgiveness can bring them the peace that they need.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the victims' families knew that she didn't maliciously try to murder their particular loved one, but her dirtbag actions had caused their deaths. As you'd expect, the defense argued for leniency considering Lulonda's state and background. The Crown argued for the maximum sentencing. So 2 opposite ends.
Very opposite.
Yes. The judge for the case pointed out that no 2 cases are alike, and it is a delicate balancing act of the interests of the offenders, what's best for them, and the justice system and the society at large. The judge recognized that Lulonda had a need for healing and rehabilitation, but could not look the other way at the seriousness of her crimes. The judge pointed out that the fact that she had been drinking, in addition to her reduced intellectual capacity, were factors which led to explain, in part, her actions, but that they did not excuse them. Even the fact that her intent was to scare Marie and Lynette proved that she knew what she was doing was dangerous. Jail time needed to happen, but for how long? Ultimately, on June 13th, 2013, almost exactly 2 years after she committed a mass murder, Lulonda Flett was sentenced to life imprisonment for all 5 counts of manslaughter, plus 6 additional months for the arson while reckless charge. These 5 counts were ordered to be served concurrently, so at the same time, which to me just means she got 1 life sentence.
Right.
About this case, the judge stated, quote, "There is no doubt that Ms. Flett is truly remorseful for what she has done and that she will never forget the hurt and deep loss she has caused so many. She asks for their forgiveness and recognizes that she must learn to forgive herself. It is also apparent that Ms. Flett must undergo years of treatment, and there is a real question as to whether she will ever be able to productively and safely function in society without continual monitoring. Community safety and her own rehabilitation are not insignificant factors. If a life sentence were imposed on Ms. Flett, she would be eligible to be considered for parole in 7 years. If paroled, she would be required to be under community supervision for the rest of her life. Given the significant and ongoing help she needs, in addition to the need to send a strong message denouncing her conduct and confirming the value that we as a society place on human life, I am satisfied a life sentence is a fair and just punishment." Not everyone agrees with the judge that this was a fair punishment. Many feel like she should be spending the rest of her life behind bars. Norman Anderson was only 22 years old when he died. Lynette Harper had been dating him at the time, and she was one of Lulonda's intended victims. She said about Lulonda's sentence, quote, "I don't think she deserves that. I think she should spend her life in there. I still have dreams about him," meaning her boyfriend Norman, "all the time. I think he is there. Sometimes I roll over thinking he is there. I want to hold him, but there is no one there." Lynette described the ordeal of the fire. She said she and her mother, Marie, had just gone to bed when she heard crackling from the fire. She jumped out of bed and saw flames under the door of her main floor room. She woke up her mom and they ran from the house. Lynette said she was screaming, "Norman, Norman," and thought he was going to make it out. When she got outside and realized he was still inside the burning house, police had to hold her back from running back into the fire to help him. About Lulonda, Lynette said, quote, "She took so many lives and ruined so many families. I don't know if she feels any differently now, but she did state at the time that she will never forgive Lulonda for what she did." On the flip side of this, Marie Anderson, Norman's mother, actually wrote a letter to Lulonda. In this letter, she stated, quote, "I often think about you and wonder how you must be feeling. I am writing you this letter to let you know I am not mad or angry with you, and that I love you even though I never met you. It is really hard for me to think about this person that I love so much that was taken away from me suddenly. I pray that things will go well for you in court, and I do not want to lay charges, but it's not up to me to make that decision. I want you to know I want to put this behind me and move on with my life. God bless you and take care, Marie Anderson." And I wrote just wow.
Yeah, that is incredible.
Evelyn Lafort, Robert's mother, had mixed feelings when hearing the sentence. She said, quote, "I realize that nothing can bring my son back, so I guess the justice system has done what they can." She described her son as a kind man who never had much in life. Despite Lulonda being in jail, Evelyn feels like she will never get closure. She said, quote, "Any mother that loses a child knows the heartache. I think it is important to remember that no one gets to judge the feelings of those affected by violent crimes. If someone forgives or isn't there yet or never can, it is their journey alone and no one can comment on how they should react. I hope everyone who was involved in this case can find healing and have hopefully moved forward as best they can." Lulonda was age 40 when she caused the deaths of 5 innocent people and has the chance of getting out of prison in her 50s if she isn't out already. I looked into it, and as far as I could tell, Lulonda is still incarcerated at the Women's Correctional Center in Headingley, Manitoba. If she was released on parole, there was no public record of it. At the time of her court proceedings, she stated that she wished it had been her that died. So I don't know if she even filed a request for parole, but she would have been eligible in 2018 because the judge allowed her 2 years served leading up to the sentence to count as time served. The other thought that came to me was how Lulonda enjoyed the structure of the residential school. Perhaps she feels similarly towards prison.
That's a good thought.
I will point out, though, that an appeal, I believe, to her sentence was rejected by the Manitoba Court of Appeal in November of 2014. Lastly, I looked up the address that the fire was set, and it looks like the house has been repaired, although there was no longer an enclosed porch in the front of the house. The repairs were estimated to cost $100,000 at the time, and I'm unsure if the home is still a rooming house. For some, I imagine it would be eerie to live in a home where so much suffering and damage took place. And that is the case of a drunken and violent woman who blamed others for her actions and sought revenge regardless of the deadly consequences. The dirtbag arsonist turned murderer, Lulonda Flett.
I can see how you said that people were going to be torn.
Mm-hmm.
But I still think she's a dirtbag.
She definitely is a dirtbag.
I'm leaning more that way because I feel like she had a choice.
It all comes down to choices, doesn't it? But I even feel like the example of the victim impact statements that I shared showed the different degrees between being super angry, being loving, and being somewhere in between.
Mm-hmm.
So listeners, let us know where you fall. Let us know what you think about this case. Did Lulonda get what she deserved? Should she have spent more time? Let us know what you think.
And we'll be back again next week with another case.
And until then,
see ya.
Bye. Ooh, murder at the manor. Okay, just checking my levels in case I hit my mic.
Oh no, Christy, don't hit your mic.
Be kind.
Oh, dang it.
As she hits her mic.
Karma. It's fine.
It's fine.
It's fine.
We'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. If it's not fine.
I'll be there in spirit with you to figure it out.
But you can see why, like, at one point I was like, I can't even do this case and we're recording tomorrow because I could not figure out the names. I was able to access a few dork documents.
I didn't write it. I didn't read it out loud.
I don't remember which one
That's
it was.
how suggestive you are.
Yep, because I know you. That's why we're friends. You didn't have to say anything and I got the joke. At first, authorities had to deter... Donna Bear Glover prepared this Ultimately, huh?
I was going to take a guess. 5 to 8 years.
Oh, that's a good guess. Sadly.
I know the Canadian system.
Yep.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.